Welcome to the Behaviorist Book Club. We're a community of busy, research-focused practitioners, BCBAs, just trying to stay in touch with the current literature in our field. You can go ahead and follow my website, www.behavioristbookclub.com, Twitter @behavioristbc, and I even am on Facebook now, the Behaviorist Book Club. This series is, of course, JABA in one take. Today's episode is continuing on volume 54, issue number 4. We're about 20 articles in at this point, and I think next week we'll actually finish off the entire 4th issue and the volume 54, because that'll be the last issue of the year, and we'll get to move on to more exciting and different styles of articles as we go. I think I'm going to mix in some verbal behavior articles, as that's something I've been really fascinated with lately, and maybe learn some like clinically practical tacting, manding, things like that. Anyways, without procrastinating any longer, let's get into this article. It's called The Accumulated and Distributed Response Reinforcer Arrangements During the Treatment of Escape Maintain Problem Behavior, written by Dr. Michelle Frank Crawford, Dr. John Barrero, Eli Newcomb and Trang Doan, Alyssa Fisher, and Dr. Griffin W. Rooker. This came out of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, as well as the Kennedy Krieger Institute. And I want to preface this by exposing my slight bias to this article. Michelle, I had the luxury of having Michelle as one of my BCBA supervisors when I was just a supervisee. And I can confidently say that she was one of my favorite, if not my favorite, supervisor I ever had. When you meet her, she is so clinically minded with such a devotion to research. There's not one day that I worked with her that she wasn't evaluating some type of research angle of the clinical work that she was doing. And that really shaped me into the research-focused clinician I am now. So I just want to say off the bat, if you ever get the privilege of meeting her, take advantage of it, because she's a wonderful clinician and an even better researcher. So this study specifically is, I believe, one of her last studies to get her doctoral degree, and it's looking at escape maintain problem behavior and the usage of reinforcement, specifically looking at the arrangement between accumulated versus distributed reinforcement. So accumulated reinforcement is when you collect all of the reinforcement as you go and then get the large reward at the end. So for example, every correct answer, you get 30 seconds of iPad time. You accumulate that over 10 correct answers, and then you have 10 times 30, 300 seconds or 5 minutes of iPad time at the end of your work. Versus distributed is short and interspersed. So with that same example of iPad time, every correct answer, you get 30 seconds of iPad time immediately following the correct answer. And after 10 correct answers, you just get a simple 30 seconds for the last one, because you've already taken up all of your little reinforcers and breaks in between. So when you look at the way that practitioners usually arrange reinforcement, in my opinion, and what I've seen most often, is it's typically distributed. And that's echoed by the fact that distributed reinforcement has gotten a lot more focus in the research literature. And there's a lot of advantages to that, which we'll talk about in a second. But there's also advantages to this new accumulated style of reinforcement. And if you think about it, that's kind of how a lot of naturally occurring reinforcement arrangements occur in everyday life. I don't get, $30 for every 5 minutes I spend at work. I get a certain amount of money at my paycheck every 2 weeks. That in itself is a accumulated reinforcement. For every billable hour that I conduct, I don't get cash handed to me right afterwards. It's only at the end of 2 weeks or a month or whatever your payment schedule is that you get your accumulated reinforcement for that 2 weeks. So in general, when you're dealing with escape maintain problem behavior, or any problem behavior really, all of the treatments seek to do two things. The first is to disrupt the response reinforcer relation through perhaps extinction. So problem behavior immediately turns into reinforcer, problem behavior, reinforcer. There's a functional relation there. So a treatment can attempt to break that up and remove that if-then relationship. So problem behavior does not produce reinforcement, or alter the motivation through DRA style procedures. So perhaps problem behavior still results in escape from demands, but compliance results in a longer escape from demands, access to an item as well as escape from demands. And specifically, the DRA style procedure when you're working with escape maintain problem behavior is called DNRA, differential negative reinforcement. This is when following compliance while problem behavior is on extinction, the client gets access to escape. So you put the child in their table work, they start to do their table work, they engage in problem behavior. You do not provide escape. Instead, you continue prompting. As soon as they comply with the academic task, as soon as they complete the structured amount of work, whether that be a math worksheet or reading a book, whatever the demand is, they then get escape from that task. So you're flipping the contingencies. You're disrupting the response reinforcer relation, as well as potentially altering the motivation. So the weakness of this is that extinction, as I just described, is typically a key component of differential negative reinforcement of alternative behavior. You're not just reinforcing compliance, you're putting problem behavior on extinction. That extinction implies all of the side effects that are inherent when using extinction procedures. So extinction-induced aggression, behavioral variability, all of these different things that can happen when you use extinction bursts. A lot of these negative side effects we would want to avoid. And the way we can avoid them is by increasing the positive motivation through the alternative behaviors reinforcement. So reinforcing completing the math worksheet or that academic task, increasing that reinforcement will reduce the side effects of extinction. And one of the ways we can increase that reinforcement is by manipulating the parameters at which the client acquires reinforcement. So by acquiring reinforcement via a more preferred method, so perhaps accumulated is preferred, so acquiring reinforcement in a more accumulated way, that may decrease the side effects of extinction. Essentially, this paper and all the other papers associated with increasing preference for DRAs is just making the child enjoy the treatment more, or helping the child to enjoy the treatment more, finding ways to make the reinforcers more valuable and the other side effects of extinction less likely to occur. In fact, researchers have gone so far to remove extinction as a procedure in DNRA just to see what would happen. So in this case, you're removing the extinction component, so you're obviously avoiding side effects of extinction, but that implies that problematic behavior will also result in a break as well as appropriate behavior. Lawley in 1999 showed that when compliance of academic tasks produced a break and problem behavior produced a break, the child leaned towards problematic behavior producing a break based on their learning history. So DNRA was ineffective without extinction as a component. Now, when an edible or another positive reinforcer was added to DNRA, so at this point, compliance produced a break plus an edible, problem behavior produced a break, they found that problem behavior did reduce and compliance increased. So in that case, adding the edible was essential to increasing the preference of the reinforcer acquired on compliance, and problem behavior reduced as a result. It's kind of like the application of the matching law. The organism's behavior is going to flow where the reinforcement is. And if there's more reinforcement for engaging in problem behavior, well, that's what the client is going to do. However, if you can stack the reinforcement for the appropriate behavior, you can reduce the problematic behavior simply by relying on the matching law and the client's natural tendency to go to where the reinforcement is. And it's a really advantageous way to reduce problematic behavior while not engaging in procedures that may be aversive to the kid. A lot of times these extinction bursts correspond with high amounts of negative affect, and that's not something that we want to have in our clinics. We want them to be very nice, friendly, fun places, and a lot of negative affect is not the way to go with that. Now, the limitations of this DNRA without extinction research is that almost all examinations are of the distributed type. So nobody has really looked at DNRA without extinction with accumulated reinforcement. And like I said before, the advantages of distributed are multifold, and there's a reason why it's been used so much. So when you're working with somebody who has escape maintain problem behavior, the advantage of short interspersed breaks are really powerful. That may reduce the aversiveness of the demands tasks in general. In addition, there's frequent reinforcement, so you get multiple instances to reinforce compliance and appropriate behavior. You can get less satiation because you're only giving bits and pieces of a preferred item at a time. However, the limitations are perhaps longer durations. If the client is able to consume and satiate on an item with those short interspersed times, then you actually run into satiation because there's too much reinforcement being provided at one time. And really the biggest disadvantage of distributed is also the largest advantage of accumulated, in that when you're using accumulated reinforcement, you can provide a much higher magnitude of reinforcer. Instead of 30 seconds on the iPad, you can actually give 5 minutes, 10 minutes on the iPad. And what may happen there is that because the client values that reinforcer so much when there's a longer amount of time, you may see preference immediately shift towards accumulated just because they can get that longer amount of time in one stretch. So the new research on accumulated reinforcement that's been coming out in the last 5 to 10 years has shown that potentially there's less problem behavior, there's faster skill acquisition, and shorter overall duration when using an accumulated method of reinforcement. However, because this research is so new, it's hard to say if those results are idiosyncratic to each participant or if they persist across participants and individuals. Because if they do, then that may suggest a analytical shift towards accumulated reinforcement versus distributed, but we need a lot more evidence to support that. So the purpose of this study was to continue that research line, continue examining if those valuable aspects of accumulated reinforcement persist across clients. In addition to finally study accumulated reinforcement without extinction and with DRA, and then also with DNRA in isolation. So having no extinction, having positive reinforcement, and just having negative reinforcement. There were 8 participants. They had varying vocal verbal skills. I did like the fact that they did include the different vocal and verbal abilities. I think this helps to provide some context to the participants, but really their vocal skills ranged from vocal approximations to full sentences. So we had a wide range of participants. All functional analyses showed a sensitivity to escape as a reinforcer. Some functional analyses were just simply pairwise arrangements of control and escape to confirm an already suspected functions, and some were full functional analyses in terms of the traditional 1982-94 Iwata functional analysis. After confirming the functions of the behavior was escape, they moved on to preference assessments using MSWOs to identify edibles for the positive reinforcer aspect of the study, and then brief token training was conducted. Everyone had a history of token training in the past, all 8 participants. What the experimenters did really was just confirm and reestablish a consistent learning history, and really just briefly go over the concepts and contingencies in token training. So experiment 1 looked to evaluate 3 different preferences. They first wanted to look at accumulated versus distributed access to food, accumulated versus distributed access to break, and then accumulated versus distributed access to food plus break, all using a concurrent chains arrangement. So what they wanted to look at and what they were evaluating was, if you prefer accumulated food, does that mean that you also prefer accumulated break and accumulated food plus break? Or is it likely that you may prefer distributed break but accumulated food? They wanted to tell if within one reinforcer class, so in this case food, if the preference would generalize to other reinforcer classes like break or food plus break. They did 3 different concurrent chains arrangements. They examined the accumulated versus distributed positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, or both, like I just described. Within each of the concurrent chains arrangement, there was 3 terminal links. The first one was accumulated, the next one was distributed, and the next one was no reinforcement. So, for example, the client number 1 walked into the room and there were 3 cards placed in front of him. This was the negative reinforcement concurrent chains arrangement. So we were evaluating preference for accumulated versus distributed breaks. 1 card corresponded with an accumulated break condition. The next card corresponded with a distributed break condition. And the third one corresponded with a no reinforcement condition. Guided exposure to all of these initial links included the therapist prompting each card and then providing the contingency. And then there was a discrimination test in which participants had to ID the card based on a vocal prompt done by the therapist. Immediately, you're starting to see here that the verbal behavior skills that were required to complete this concurrent change arrangements were a little bit higher than one would expect. So I think that's an important thing to note if you were to try to replicate this. So within that terminal link selection, 10 trials were conducted. So if the child selected the accumulated positive reinforcer, then 10 demands were placed, and they accumulated a certain amount of food based on each correct response. This continued for all 3 of the different concurrent chains arrangements. In terms of the results, unfortunately, I'd like to say that there was idiosyncratic preferences. And this is not at all uncommon when you're working with preference assessments and skill acquisition, nor should it be uncommon, because if you just think about general day-to-day life, I prefer something different than somebody else who prefers something different than somebody else. Why would we expect that to be different in the children we serve? However, it does present more difficult times for us as practitioners. So when I say idiosyncratic preferences, what I mean that some kids preferred accumulated reinforcement in all conditions. Some just preferred conditions in which the edible was available. Some preferred accumulated edibles and distributed breaks, and some were just indifferent. Like I said, this is similar but presents challenges to clinicians. What this really supports is that the old phrase of "you met one child with autism, you met one child with autism" rings true for all the procedures that we use. Yes, a concurrent chains arrangement might be a little difficult and arduous to set up, but it's really important to assess clear preferences for all of these things for each child that you work with. Assumptions are just not going to work when you're evaluating things as important as what type of reinforcement is going to produce the fastest skill acquisition. So unfortunately, there wasn't a clear answer in that concurrent chains arrangement comparison, but what it did show is that most of the kids preferred one or the other. There was, I think it's only 1 or 2 who had indifference. And by that, I mean preferred accumulated versus distributed at the same, they selected them at the same amount. Most kids preferred either accumulated or distributed, with I think a couple more kids preferring distributed. So then moving on to experiment 2, they wanted to evaluate if accumulated reinforcement was effective in decreasing escape maintain problem behavior. They wanted to compare accumulated positive versus accumulated negative reinforcement, and then finally to determine if accumulated reinforcement improves the durability of a treatment following schedule thinning. The theory was whenever you're doing differential reinforcement or DNRA, eventually you're going to hit a point where you have to start fading your schedule of reinforcement. And if the schedule is already an accumulated schedule of reinforcement, then it may be more difficult for the client to identify that there's a schedule fade going on, and there may not be as much of an extinction effect produced. So in a distributed arrangement, as soon as you go from an FR1 to an FR2, it's very easy for the client to tact, I got a reinforcer here, I didn't get a reinforcer here. During accumulated, the theory was it might be a little more difficult for the child to tack that difference, so they might be more accustomed and accepting of the fade, thereby ending up with improved durability. Experimental design that was used was an ABC reversal and multi-element design. The multi-element compared distributed food, distributed break, accumulated food, and accumulated break. The general procedures was 20 instructional trials with the same prompting plus task across all different multi-elements. The correct response produced reinforcement. The incorrect moved on to the next trial. Note that there was no error correction procedures here. The only teaching procedure, if you will, was the differential reinforcement, or the DNRA, the reinforcement that was given following a correct response. The first condition was a baseline, which was identical to the test condition of the FA, and there was escape for problematic behavior. The reinforcement condition depended on whatever multi-element condition was in place, but generally throughout all, escape was provided contingent on problem behavior. So there was no extinction in any of these procedures. Escape was always provided contingent on problem behavior. And then finally, the next condition was schedule thinning, in which they increased the response requirement from a fixed ratio 1 to a 2, 3, 4, all the way up to FR10 in an attempt to spread out the schedule as much as possible. The results of this were pretty interesting. Compliance was roughly similar, indicating that accumulated versus distributed reinforcement didn't affect compliance. It also indicates that it didn't affect speed of skill acquisition, which is interesting considering that was one of the presumed advantages of accumulated reinforcement that we talked about higher up in the article. The duration data showed pretty varied results. Some accumulated conditions lasting much longer than the distributed conditions, which is also very much confounding past research. In no cases was accumulated reinforcement more effective than distributed break, but accumulated food was more effective than distributed food in three out of the 4 participants. Distributed breaks did seem to be a little bit more effective for maintaining low rates of problem behavior, which also differs from prior research. So really, this article really gave us a mixed bag of results. In some cases, it confirmed what we suspected about accumulated reinforcement, specifically about accumulated positive reinforcement may be more effective than distributed distributed positive reinforcement, but it also contradicted some of the hypotheses garnered from prior research studies. So the duration hypothesis, the fact that duration is going to be shorter and thereby accumulated reinforcement is more efficient, did not hold true. And then the idea that compliance and skill acquisition may quicken during accumulated reinforcement also did not hold true. Generally speaking, what can we draw from this? Accumulated breaks were more preferred and produced similar outcomes to distributed breaks. Accumulated food was at least as effective in reducing problem behavior. And those two findings begin to suggest that accumulated reinforcement, even though the data seemed a little messy and was inconsistent, still may be slightly more effective than distributed reinforcement. But I don't think we can really draw any concrete treatment effects from this study, just because there just seems to be a lot of conflicting research. I think we need a lot more studies evaluating the different aspects of distributed versus accumulated reinforcement to really know exactly what's going on in these settings. In terms of schedule thinning, there was mixed results. There may be an idea that preference will shift from accumulated to distributed as the schedule fades. And I think that's almost like it's kind of to be expected, because at a certain point, if you're not changing the unit price of the item, the unit price being the amount of responses required to get 30 seconds of iPad, for example, 30 seconds of break, then each time you fade your schedule, your distributed reinforcement schedule becomes a little closer to an accumulated reinforcement schedule. And to me, what that suggests is that there may be, similar to a ratio strain, an accumulated reinforcement strain, saying that the client is willing to wait 10 responses to get 5 minutes of iPad, but they're unlikely to wait 10 responses to get 2.5 minutes of iPad. So as the amount of reinforcement decreases relative to the amount of responses needed to gain that item, as the unit price increases, there seems to be some kind of strain where preference could shift from accumulated to distributed reinforcement. I think that's definitely an area for future research to really dive into. I think the concept of applying a ratio strain to this in a parametric analysis would be really interesting. So kind of a mixed bag in terms of results. In terms of drawing conclusions, I think that we can comfortably say that the advantages of programming positive reinforcement during a break, so programming a break plus edible, is that extinction is less heavily relied upon, which is good. I think that this definitely leans us to the fact that individuals may prefer a synthesized contingency when they escape from academic tasks, which I think lines up really well with a lot of the research done by Western New England and that group with the practical functional assessment. Typically they do prescribe a synthesized contingency contingent on problem behavior. That synthesized contingency a lot of times being escape from an aversive event plus access to something. And that's essentially what this article demonstrated, is that you can not rely on extinction and use a synthesized contingency to reduce problematic behavior, dodging all of those extinction side effects. In addition, the methods for assessing preference, I think, were really valuable here. While we may not get really strong, clear, every single child prefers accumulated reinforcement, what this shows is that there's easy, clear, well, I don't know if easy is the right word. There's clear methodology that a clinician can follow to assess preference. The concurrent chains arrangement, I feel like I see it in almost every single paper because it's so common now in terms of social validity and assessing treatment preference that it's really just becoming a really powerful tool. And I think clinicians would do well to learn it and understand it throughout their entire careers. And conducting them, I think, is going to become more and more important as social validity shifts away from surveys and into observed behavior through something like the concurrent chains arrangement. And finally, for a consideration, finishing your drive to work perhaps, or walking the dog, when programming reinforcers, do you ever consider accumulated versus distributed? Do you ever consider a unit price, schedule fading, ratio strain? Sometimes I feel like as a BCBA, I get so caught up in other aspects, such as reducing a tantrum or working on pica, that I kind of forget to evaluate the reinforcement that I do for skill acquisition. And a lot of times the skill acquisition goes hand in hand, or arguably is more important than reducing a problematic behavior. And evaluating and thinking clearly and logically about the reinforcers that you provide, and specifically the preference for those reinforcers relative to other arrangements, is really important. I know that as I go into my week, this is a Monday episode, so we're all getting ready to go into that full work week. I'm going to start thinking long and hard about the different magnitudes, dimensions, quantities, and qualities of reinforcement before I go in and just prescribe them willy-nilly. So that's all I got, guys. Remember, you can find me at my website, www.behavioristbookclub.com. Remember, the library is open, so I do have a library of behavior analytic articles, over 100 plus curated publications, easy to download, easy to find, sorted by everything from teaching MANs and tax to reducing problem behavior maintained by tangibles or MAN compliance, things like that. You can check it out at my website. And that is the end of our episode. So I will see you all on Tuesday for a really interesting feeding article dealing with expulsions and modified chin prompts. Thank you, everyone, and have a great week.